Welcome to Om Times TV, a division of Om Times Media and Broadcasting. Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. If the name Whitley Streiber sounds familiar, it's likely in relation to the iconic book he wrote in the late 1980s called Communion, a True Story, Encounters with the Unknown, which shares a non-fiction account of his experiences with non-human entities. A writer, scholar, and author of multiple fictional and non-fictional books, and host of the spiritual and science-themed podcast Dreamland, Whitley Streiber joins me now to share the 10 best spiritual books that had the biggest influence on his life journey, and hopefully to talk about his latest book, Jesus, A New Vision, which is widely regarded as the most provocative book of his career, which is no mean feat considering the massive impact that Communion made back in the 1980s. Whitley Streiber, welcome.
I'm glad I'm here. Thank you. I'm very pleased that you're having me here.
So, Whitley, you're a prolific author with a number of well-known horror fiction books like Wolfen and The Hunger, to your credit, alongside your best-selling non-fiction books like Communion. Why isn't there any horror books in your list of 10 best?
Any horror book? It never occurred to
Not
me.
a single horror book. Not a single horror book appears in your 10 best list. I'm curious.
No, there isn't. I thought that the 10 best list was a list about my spiritual journey, and I don't see a connection.
You don't?
No, I don't. There is a connection, obviously, to the dark goddess Kali, for example, who is a great part of my life. But I don't see a connection to horror novels. Perhaps there is a certain amount of my spiritual journey in a couple of my horror novels, The Wolfen and The Hunger. And there's, of course, one about a hidden dark church inside the Catholic Church called the Night Church. But my journey has always been one toward understanding, and the dark side of my life came out of into the forefront, came out of the subconscious and into the forefront when I had that close encounter in December of 1985 that inspired the book Communion, which you've made reference to. That was it was as if, in fact, during the experience, I thought it was a nightmare, and it even crossed my mind that it would make a good horror novel, until, to my absolute horror and real horror, I discovered over the course of the first few minutes that it was really happening. There was no nightmare, that it was an actual physical experience, and these bizarre beings were there. It's just incredible, extraordinary.
Well, you've had some rather horrific, I would regard them as horrific experiences. And I just wondered, those experiences and writing the horror books, whether that might have given you some kind of, I don't know, inspiration, that moved you forward on your spiritual journey?
Well, I've thought it might be the other way around. I've thought that the fact that I wrote those books um, inspired these beings to come into my life because they figured, well, he is entertained by fear, and this is going to be really scary. So let's try him and see what happens when we wake him up. And I think many people have this experience, but it doesn't ever reach the level. It doesn't ever become conscious. It does for some people, obviously, because the communion book unexpectedly created a flood of response by the thousands and thousands of people who wrote letters. This is before email to me, saying that they recognized the face on the cover of the book and that this had happened to them. And this entire archive is now at a university in the US, Rice University, where it has just been digitized, and it is going to be eventually, as soon as the privacy concerns are satisfied, the digital uh, 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 file will be made available to scholars.
Did you, were you on your spiritual path when you had those experiences?
Oh, absolutely. I have been on a spiritual path since I knew what that was. And that means in my teens. My mother, who had a rather macabre sense of humor, but also was a very interesting person, decided when I was the age of 10 that it was time to introduce me to authors like Kafka and H. Munro Saki. And so I was steeped in this eerie literature, but it's also eerie literature that has a very strange relationship to what is unknown within us, and especially Kafka. And of course, Saki explores the dark side of consciousness and of desire. Um, uh, Mother would read me the story Sredni Vashtar about the little boy who lives with his aunt, and she's really a perfectly nice person, and that's what makes the story so eerie, because he eventually ends up feeding her to this creature. I've forgotten what kind of animal it was that he keeps in a cage in the back garden, and she unwittingly goes in and eventually is devoured. Um, uh, and this process of the devouring of what is orderly and uh, accepted in one's life is, I think, an essential part of any spiritual journey. It's initiatory, and from the initiation described in Sredni Vashtar, which is an initiation both of the ant and the boy, because he is now left to fend uh, for himself in a completely new life. And she, of course, whatever happens to her, she had a new life for sure.
For
In any
sure.
case, in any case, then the communion experience is
So it seems like we've lost connection, and I'm not sure whether it's Whitley's end or my end. Whitley, are you still
I
there?
was invaded. Yes, I was invaded, and I was uh, uh, attacked physically and badly injured, as it turned out. It took 20 years for the injuries to my rectum to really heal. I was under medical care for years and years because of that. And so it was quite serious. but it was also an overturning of everything I understood about the world. I wasn't the boy in Sredni Vashtar only. I was also the aunt, both of us, because I was devoured and I was also completely revised. My life was revised. But as to my spiritual journey, it started there with Sredni Vashtar, I think. And then it went on through my teenage years with a struggle with Catholicism. And then beyond that, there was there was I, I moved to England in 1968. My family is I'm 70% English, even though my last name is German, but that's what it is to be an American. In any case, um, I had been to England a number of times as a boy with my parents, and wonderful journeys traveling over on the Queen Mary, which was incidentally not the most comfortable ship in the world. It's extolled now as one of the great ships of all time, but she rocked and she rolled a lot because she was so tall. In any case, in 1968, I moved to England for a year. And when I was there, I was at the London Film School and also living at the International Students House. And I began to come into contact, not with spiritual teachers, but with people who were on journeys of a kind that I had never heard of. This led me, when I went back to New York in 1969, into an interest in the Gurdjieff Foundation and the works of G.I. Gurdjieff. And this became very much part of my life. My wife, Anne, and I met in 1969 in using a dating service. I had come back to New York. I was 23 years old. I wanted girls in my life, and I had my usual failures in England. I've never been successful with English girls. They're too subtle for my big-footed American approach. In any case, so I was out on the hunt, and I went to singles bars and soon found out that all of the other low-level employees in various advertising agencies and law firms were all selling themselves as doctors and lawyers and airline pilots, but I don't like to lie. And so I would only say I was a media planner, and none of the girls were interested in fooling around with any media planners. That's a low-level job in advertising, clerk-like
Yeah.
job. So I've tried this dating service called Mind Mates because I wanted a smart girl. I wanted a girl as smart as me or smarter, even better. And I found my wife, Anne, who was smarter than me, much smarter. She's back there. And we embarked on a journey in the Gurdjieff work. Could it be possible to wake up? I thought perhaps once we got started in the first 6 months or so, that Anne had maybe been in something like this or in the work itself in a prior life, because she immediately understood it deeply. Mr. Gurdjieff's work, All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, is a daunting task to read. Anne read it in 2 weeks, and not just read it, but understood it, and understood it profoundly. And also felt like the group we were in were a bunch of idiots, and that the leaders of the group and of the entire foundation were all idiots. And she would say, they've been tricked by Gurdjieff. He's a trickster. They don't understand what they're doing. They think they're waking up, but the work is actually a sleep machine. It puts you to sleep so deeply that you can't help but notice you're asleep. That's the real idea. And so she would go, but she wasn't too keen on it. And I was totally sold. I've been in the work for all my life. But in recent years, I have become more and more to agree with Anne that there are other ways of journeying outside of the context of this particular one that maybe are as fruitful or more fruitful. And what is this journey? When I was lying there in that strange little room with those bizarre people around me, my impression of it was that they were insects, is what they looked like to me, but big, much bigger than you would think. And I was stripped of all of my expectations and understanding of the world. And I was just left there, kind of blank. And this is the place, more than with my mother, more than with the work, more than with any other of these transitional moments in my life, the place where it started. There, I was stripped bare and left naked, lying on the ground, bleeding. That's the beginning of any real spiritual journey, in my opinion.
Yeah. This is fascinating to hear you talk about this. I haven't heard you say any of this before. We do need to get on with your list, but what I would like to do, because it is such an unusual list in terms of what we normally get. I mean, there are books, I can honestly say I haven't read one of them. That never happens. It has never happened before. But if we can move through those reasonably, I don't want to gloss over them. I want you to tell us what impact they had on your spiritual journey. But if we can move through them at a fair clip, I'd love to hear more about that, how that.
Okay, well, I sent you a list of 10 books.
You did.
You want to go through the list?
Yes, and the first one is
Okay.
the Gospel of Thomas, the
The
hidden
Sayings
sayings.
Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting book. Well, first of all, this all revolves around Jesus: A New Vision, which is not my latest book, but it is certainly a very important book in my life, and I want to talk about it today because this is much more attuned to what your show is about anyway. Okay, the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. This is a group of sayings that were appeared around the time of the earliest canonical gospel, Mark, and perhaps were probably there before that. And in the Sayings Gospel, that you find a very different Jesus. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus is a master, more than a teacher. He is a miracle spinner and a direct expression of the highest deity. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse today. Why that has to do with very much with the later Roman Empire and Constantine, who in what had happened to the Roman Empire through starting in 100 AD was that it had had a series of plagues. We know why these plagues occurred. They occurred because of a change in solar output. In other words, climate change reduced the amount of food that the fields of the whole empire could produce, and something known as the Roman climate optimum ended in the reign of Marcus Aurelius in about 100 AD, and drought occurred all over the world, which will happen here, by the way, in the next few years again. In any case, this caused people's immune system to be stressed because they didn't have enough food. They couldn't get food. And the result of that was that diseases, which had always been localized because of all the good roads the Romans had built and their sea routes and so forth, quickly spread over the whole empire time and time again in a world where they had no notion of germ theory or anything like that. And they went to their gods. They went to Asclepius and to their other gods because the gods were the ones who were responsible for protecting them. And it didn't work, of course. And by the time Constantine came around, there was a basic collapse in the willingness to sacrifice. And in those days, it wasn't a question of church versus state. Church and state were the same thing. Authority flowed from the gods right down to the emperor and beyond. And that authority was becoming despised. And his mother was a Christian. He saw the Didache, this wonderfully organized rule of life, community rule. And he adopted Christianity for the whole empire and changed Jesus from the teacher of the sayings gospel into a sun god, moved his place of birth for probably Nazareth to Bethlehem, put him in the cave of Adonis, where Venus had given birth to Adonis, and said, forget Venus and Adonis, Jesus was born here in humble circumstances, and turned it all around and made the Jesus that we worship today. I'm not interested too much in that Jesus. I'm interested in the Jesus of the teachings. And in the sayings gospel, the Jesus of the teachings, there's a distant reflection of Buddha's teachings in the sayings gospel, by the way. Jesus is, at one point he says, he takes one of the disciples aside and tells them a secret. And they, of course, everyone else wants to know, what is the secret? What did he say? And this disciple says, if I told you, you would have to stone him to death. Another point he says in the sayings gospel, don't ignore the dietary rules of the Jews. Eat what you're given. Go to any house. Eat what you're given. And he tries everything throughout the sayings to distance himself and to make the seekers see him as not a god, but as another person who can, if they are careful, impart wisdom, but they have to be their own person. And then you get to the canonical gospels and it's a government business. It's not, you can't be your own person anymore. I responded to the sayings gospel. I think, again, it gets back to my mama, who was a rebel to the core, even though she was always a Catholic. The Hermetica. Well, I have been studying the Hermetica on a journey toward gnosis, essentially all of my adult life and before. I have found in the Hermetica an extremely subtle and powerful journey that is only partly revealed. The rest of it that's not there, you have to find in yourself. And I think that's the idea. The Hermetica are an initiatory text, and their purpose, I think, is to lead the individual into a place in themselves where they are facing questions that they cannot bear to leave unanswered, but which they cannot answer. That is the direction of gnosis.
Yeah.
The pyramid text. All right, I came upon the pyramid text years and years ago, and I thought the translations were just appalling. I don't think we've successfully translated early hieroglyphics at all. The translators are so Eurocentric. They don't they assumed that this was the work of silly, innocent, get those, not the work of someone primitive. This is the work of people with very sophisticated minds, and minds more sophisticated by far than ours in many important ways. I came across a book called The Dawning Moon of the Mind, Unlocked Texts by Susan Brind Morrow. And it was revelatory because in it, at the opening wall of the Pyramid of Unas, which is the oldest religious text in the world, by the way, as you go in, the hieroglyphs describe the relationship between the body and what we in the West have distilled down into this talk about primitive word, the soul, which is like saying the ocean is a drop of water. Okay, but it is true, but it's also very not true. So in any case, it describes the 7 taniter along the spine as serpents, 7 serpents circling the bright lit serpent of the spine, drawing the energy of experience, essentially the second body, the lowest of the bodies of our bodies that are non-physical. And this is the real mechanism, because these are the chakras. Of course, they later became the chakras, and it's the real mechanism of the transfer of experience into higher levels. All experience goes in, and we are here. We're locked in at the C1 vertebra, which there are masters and our visitors who give me such trouble in 1985 happen to be among those who can unlock this. And when it unlocks, you feel all of the tanitra, or the chakras, open, and your second body comes right out. And you have then a different relationship to the world around you. But in any case, and when you die, that will happen. In any case, we're locked into the stream of time now. We are here experiencing the flow of time flowing past us, bringing us experience that we are taking in and intensifying into this energy. And when the body is finished, this energy is what we have gathered of our lives. And it's why it's so important to understand the way of life that, I see these poor, impoverished people living the way they do, the great leaders, billionaires and so forth. They have actually got nothing. They are empty, completely empty. And then the little guy struggling along with his books and his little job and his big journey, he's rich. And of course, that's an essential ingredient in understanding the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm
going to have to interrupt you there because we have to go to a break.
Okay.
But we can continue and also continue with the rest of the books after this. You're listening to an OBS Spiritual Book Club interview, and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on his life journey is author, writer, scholar, and host of the spiritual and science-themed podcast Dreamland, Whitley Streiber. We'll be back with more from Whitley Streiber after this break.
Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, And when I'm not hosting Om Times Media's flagship radio show, What Is Going On, and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit sedgbeer.com. Click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these three levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those three levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Whitley Streiber. We're going to have to move on to book 4, I think, and
Yes.
a little gallop through the others, because I really do want to talk about your book on Jesus.
Well, okay.
On my
But-
list is the Mahabharata.
Okay, let's go on. Where we left it was the need to draw energy into the second body from life. And the
Yes.
quality of that energy is absolutely essential. Now we get to the Mahabharata Sabaparva. This text is the text about Maya's palace, the palace of illusion, the house of ego in which we all live. And in the West, we have become massively egotistical because the material world feeds ego. And now we have the internet, which creates an artificial sense of importance because you can put things out there, and even though only 4 people see them, it feels like you're something much bigger than you are. And so we've got these gigantic egos looming around. We all walk out the world with boulders on our shoulders, struggling along, barely able to function. The Mahabharata And the idea and the exploration of Maya's palace is the way out, because the dice game in that eventually causes the destruction of the whole family that's involved, even though this man knows, he must know he's going to lose, he keeps playing the game. This is what we're doing. We're facing climate change, disastrous climate change right now in our lifetimes, including the lifetimes of old people like me. Darn it, I got to get out of here. I need an escape valve. But the children don't have an escape valve. They don't have a way out. No lifesaver, no life preserver. We are literally waltzing in Maya's palace right now, but we will not be there forever, because if we don't wake ourselves up, nature will wake us up. Nature is numbers. It doesn't care about our beliefs, our politics, anything like that. There will be people in this audience, I assume, who have some cities. And so, you can have a certain effect in nature. But ultimately, in the largest sense of the word, nature is numbers. Zen flesh, Zen bones. Okay, this is a little segue. Paul Reps. I met Paul Reps years ago at in a small group of friends, and I realized that, I knew his work, of course, and I thought, my goodness, here I am at this little group. There's 10 of us here listening to Paul Reps talking, and I can ask him any question I want to. And so I asked him a question and got back a koan that has been defining for me. I said to him, what is Zen? And he said, why do you ask me? And I said, because you are one of the great scholars of Zen in the world. And he said, then you know. That's the koan. It's fabulous. The perfect koan for an intellectual. Ecclesiastes, the great text of inner peace, the inner journey, and I always read it. I read it in the King James version for the simple reason that parts of the Bible don't work if they're not poetic, if they're not poetry. And Ecclesiastes is poetry. And the King James Committee understood that, and they wrote it. Their Bible is a poetic Bible, and their Ecclesiastes is the greatest of the poetic sequences. And if you read Ecclesiastes in that poetry, no matter how bad things are, and I'm a person who's had plenty of bad in my life, you will find a place of peace. All and everything. Okay. People who get too attached to the work begin to think of it as a kind of an instructional text. I've even heard people saying that the Gurdjieff mentions a second moon called Anulios, and people assume that it's real. And of course, it's not real. It's not meant to be real. The book is a novel. It's a teaching novel, but it's not teaching you factual material. It's teaching you about a very, very important journey and a reality about mankind that's extremely profound. And I can sum it up quite easily. He talks about something called the organ kunda buffer. That means kundalini buffer, an organ that was placed in us in his novel long ago, and then slightly revised so that we had a little bit of access still to the Kundalini energy, the energy of our earth, and therefore the universe, which the earth gathers energy from the sun primarily, but from the whole universe, all the stars. And we're separated. We were cut off from it like an umbilical cord being cut. And we don't have a relationship with the planet anymore that works. We're dysfunctional. And the Kundalini buffer is the reason. How, therefore, does one get back to a situation in which one is admitting oneself to the childhood that is our true state? We are the children of the earth. And this work, the work of waking up, as it is expressed by Gurdjieff and many others, is the journey back. It is a journey back to the earth, a repair of the broken relationship with the planet. And this relationship broke a long time ago. There was a catastrophe back about 12,000 years ago. There's a wonderful book by Barbara Hand Clow called Catastrophobia
Yes.
that you're familiar with,
Yeah.
and that talks about whatever it was that happened in the Hindu literature, the Sanskrit literature. It was a war. In science, modern science, it was a comet apparently broke up and slammed into the earth, or there was the debris from a supernova that happened 30,000 years before came through the solar system and caused an enormous amount of trouble. So who knows exactly what happened, but we were almost completely annihilated during that period. It was down to a few thousand individuals left on the whole planet. And we have suffered the consequences ever since. We are scarred. The scar is the organ kunda buffer. Okay. In search of the miraculous, this is the methodology of the Gurdjieff system as elucidated by P.D. Uspensky. It's very dry, very intellectual, and very useful if you see it for what it is. It is not a spiritual book. It is a book of an order, and you can make an inner order in yourself with this book. That you don't have to be in the Gurdjieff Foundation. It doesn't matter. But it's a wonderful order that we can all use to organize our search and its relationship to our own inner life. But it has that limitation. It is lacking in fuzzy edges. And someone like Paul Reps, he didn't like it, I don't think, because he was all about fuzzy edges, of course. And it certainly is in the fuzzy edges that we find the Philosopher's Stone, not in the center of anything. You find the best stuff in the corner of your eye. Okay. The Devi Mahatmya is the story of Kali is told here. Kali is my goddess. I am a Kali follower. Kali came into my life quite recently. I went to India with my son and grandson, and we toured around. I was not interested in Hindu gods and deities at all, but then something happened. I had a muse, an young English woman, in fact, who was a genius and still is, I'm sure, who was helping me with my books in ways that no one else had ever been able to do. I sat at her kitchen table in her family home and wrote my last book about the visitors, them, in 2 weeks because of this extraordinary mind that was there. And I would just say to her, "Oh, what about such and such?" And she would say a few words that would completely revolutionize my thinking. So I had become dependent on her. I did not know that Kali was in my life, and I laughed. Never laugh at Kali, folks. If you do not do this. In any case, we're in India, and I see a Kali temple, and this terrifying goddess is in there. And I laughed. And I thought to myself, how stupid. Who could ever take anything like that seriously? We came back. I'm still about, and suddenly I'm doing my meditation. I meditate quite a bit, and there and entities show up. It's nothing new around here. So there's this terrifying being suddenly there, only for a few seconds, but it was very clear, and it smelled bad. It was horrifying, and it hissed at me, and I recognized it immediately. It was this picture of this goddess with their tongue hanging out and rattling skeleton skulls on a big knife that she was waving like this, waving around, and I just jumped out of my skin. And now I'm not saying that this actually came out of the outside world, but it came out of me and out of the outside world. There was a confluence where I didn't know I had was being addressed. Then the muse dropped me. She said, I don't want to work on the next book. I was devastated. I thought, my God, it's the most complex book I've ever written. I can't do it without her. I wouldn't have tried if I hadn't had her in my life. But she said, I think I've become uncomfortable because I think you've fallen in love with me. And oh God, I thought, oh, how can I have done this? Because she was right, and it was true, and it was not appropriate because she's too young. In any case, I'm past that in my life anyway. So life was blown up. Out of that came the discovery of this extraordinary, deeply fruitful energy, the destruction of the ego. That's what happened. And Kali came into my life. Okay. 10. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This is a badly damaged and badly misunderstood series of stories that talks about the early life, the childhood of Jesus. When I read it at first, I've known about it for years, and I've just discounted it. But then when I was working on my book, Jesus, the New Vision, I thought one of the things you have to do is to try to see everything in you. That's what it's about. And I took up the Infancy Gospel again, and I saw what it really is. It is the story of a very brilliant little boy stuck in a world that had no room for a peasant child who was a genius. And if you strip away all of the miracles that were obviously added later, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they were just added later. You see that. You see this wonderful, extraordinary little boy, and he comes to life. The Infancy Gospel of Jesus is actually the first story in history that contains a child as a character. And this character is very fully formed and complex. This character, if you just story his friends and the other children, his ability to get along with them, his father's fears for him, and so forth. What you have is this: a family story that had come down in the Jesus community. And then when the Roman Empire took over the story of Jesus, it was embellished. And that in Jesus, the New Vision, strip away all of the embellishments, except the miracles that probably did occur, and there are a few. Because another thing in that book, we all, with our Western arrogance, we all think, oh, well, the resurrection is apocryphal. He never really walked out of the tomb. Oh, yes, he did. And I can show clearly exactly the energies that were engaged and how he did it in the book, in Jesus, a New Vision. He did it by committing suicide by crucifixion intentionally. Okay, we have gone through the 10 books. Now it's your turn if you have any questions for me.
No, I don't have any questions. I want to know more. I want to know more about Jesus, a New Vision. What is new?
About Jesus, a New Vision? Well, I set out to, I thought to myself, I've been studying Jesus for years, and my wife was an absolutely extraordinary Jesus scholar, and I learned a lot from her. She always used to say, you have to start out by believing about Jesus, and then you begin to get to Jesus, but it takes time. And it is also a book about, as much as it is about Jesus, it's about the world he lived in and its relationship to our world. He lived in a dying world, but it did not yet know that it was dying. He knew. That's what all of his millennial prophecies are about. They're not about the end of the world. They're about the end of their world, which was the Roman Empire, which would end in a few hundred years. But at the time he was speaking, it seemed that it would be eternal. So I start out with a quote from Francis Thompson's book, The Hound of Heaven. I fled him down the night and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. This is where we all are. This is the quintessential nature of the spiritual search, of the journey. We are running like the Dickens from the truth. And in so doing, when we get tired and we get exhausted and we fall, then is when we come to Jesus. And we have our come to Jesus moment. Okay, here's the first chapter. I'll read from The Rising Star. 300,000 years ago, deep in a cave in what is now South Africa, a great mystery began. Something happened that marked the beginning of the human struggle with death, a struggle that has taken us on a long journey from magic to gods to the strangeness and promise of Jesus, and more recently to a science of medicine that has at once prolonged life and quite unexpectedly opened a new door into the meaning of death. All those eons ago, that rough place teemed with animals, including pre-human creatures like the powerful ground-dwelling Homo habilis, and a smaller, more delicate and vulnerable creature which has been named Homo naledi, man of the star. In this cave, which could not be entered by only one animal's remains were found in this cave, an owl. It was so difficult to enter this chamber that you had to really know what you were doing, and you had to be a certain size. In fact, when the archaeologists found it, they had to recruit small archaeologists in order to study it because no one else could get in. In this cave are bodies. It's a burial site. They were trying to protect their dead from the animals and so forth in the world around them, from being torn to pieces and eaten. Their dead had value to them 300,000 years ago. You go all the way from there to the journey of the Egyptians, and then to the idea of the body shall rise again incorruptible, that we take from the Egyptians, that Jesus took from his journey to Egypt. And any book about Jesus that is not about resurrection and dying and resurrection is not a real book about Jesus, because this is what he was about. You know, there's been a lot of study of the shroud. Back in the 70s, Anne and I were contacted by Father Peter Rinaldi, who was raising money for the first study of the Shroud of Turin. And we contributed, of course, because we figured that this is a sacred chance to do. And so our small contribution helped a little, I'm sure. But I hope. In any case, the two young Air Force officers who studied the shroud went to Turin, and they got a piece of the shroud. And the next thing I knew, it was going to be studied at Oxford. And I thought, this will not be truthful, because the scientists who study it cannot afford for their paradigm to be destroyed. They won't see it, even if it's right in front of their face. And I wrote to them and I said, don't do this. This will fail. You will not get the truth. And they didn't. They got what the collection was made of a part of the shroud that had already been exposed to the fire that took place in the 15th century, meaning that the carbon dating was thrown off. And it carbon dated to the 15th century or the 14th century. And of course, the usual media, the media of the dead soul, trumpeted the fact that, oh, it's all a fake. It's all a fake. But if you look carefully at the shroud, you will find that the image is on just the surface of the linen, just the surface of it. In other words, it's not a scorch mark, which would be much deeper. It's a result of a high energy flash. The only high energy flash of that kind that we can duplicate is a flash of neutrons. What happens is this, and this is repeated also in different times in the Middle Ages, which I am working on in my new book, which is called The Fourth Mind, is that if there is enough, if the body suffers enough, there comes to be enough energy for the soul to remain intact and remain in the physical world for a short time. And that's it. And he knew that. How he knew it, I don't know. I suppose he found out from Egyptian magic, because he's not the only person who has been marked as known to be resurrected in this world. Although the other stories are mostly very hard to find and very hidden. In any case, he probably did come. His second body probably was visible for a short time, and he established this level of human life. His objective was to show us that we do have this, that this is part of us. It's locked away during life, but his message is acknowledge that it exists. And if you go back to the Sayings Gospel, figure out for yourself how to make your soul rich. Figure it out for yourself. I will help you, he would say, as little as I have to. I'm here to get you going, not to lead you. So there we have it.
Wow. We've gone over time, but it was worth it. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Whitley Streiber, thank you. This has been quite an original show. They normally follow a particular pattern. This one hasn't, and I'm grateful that it hasn't, because it really has been very instructive.
Well, thank you, and I hope it wasn't too original.
Well, you know, that's not a bad thing. So we have to leave it there. We will be about 3 minutes over. So on the radio, this will stop at the 1 hour mark, but on the video, it will be complete. So people can watch it in its entirety. So if you want to know more about Whitley's list, you can go to the website at the nobspiritualbookclub.com and see the written version, which is slightly different and slightly more information in places. But go and have a look. Whitley, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome. That's it for this week. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Whitley Streiber. And don't forget to check out his book, Jesus, A New Vision. Who was it published by?
My own publishing company. I have a publishing company in Walker and Collier.
Okay, available on Amazon and probably wherever good books are sold. That's it for this week. Have to leave it there. Bye-bye.